I just want. Okay, thank you. Okay, Debbie?
Do you have another reading?
I did the reading, Debbie. I jumped ahead with the reading.
Okay, I thought you too. The apocalyptic scenes on September 11, 2001, far outstripped anything Hollywood has ever imagined. Amid the confusion, only one thing seemed certain: the world would never be the same again. These were the kind of events that Hollywood has been imagining in the worst of its movies. But American reality always outstrips the imagination. And even the best minds, the best or darkest dreamers of disaster on a gigantic scale, could not have delivered us into the nightmare available on television news channels that day. For most of us, at a certain point, the day froze. The work and all other obligations were left behind. The screen became the only reality. We entered a dreamlike state. We had seen this before, with giant budgets and special effects, but so badly rehearsed. The colossal explosions, the fierce black and red clouds, the crowds running through the streets, the contradictory, confusing information had only the feeblest resemblance to the tinny dramas of the movies Skyscraper, Backdraft, or Independence Day. Nothing could have prepared us for this. And this was excerpted from The Guardian on 9/12/2001, the day after. 21 years later, the images and stories can still bring us right back to that terrible day. Well, we don't even need images, and we don't need to close our eyes, because the images are emblazoned in our minds. So today, we're not going to talk about what we all know and what we all witnessed. We're going to focus on the good, like Arlene's student, and on our memories. We'll share stories and have time for you to share yours after Arlene speaks. The 9/11 anniversary is and always will be a time to remember not just the horrors of that day, but also the heroes. We witnessed the worst and the best in people. This is the American spirit, the human spirit. The innate tendency towards compassion and desire to help was on full display that day, and for many months, indeed, years after. Tens of thousands of people typically worked in the Pentagon and the World Trade Center, and most were able to escape. While all who endured that terrible day can be considered brave, there are some who went above and beyond in trying to save lives and ultimately prevented the tragedy from becoming even worse. I'm going to just tell you a very few. Rick Rescorla, who had fought in Vietnam, was responsible for saving more than 2,700 lives as he sang songs to keep people calm while he helped them evacuate from the World Trade Center. His wife was crying on the phone. He said, "Don't cry. I need to do this. And remember, I love you and I am very happy." He did not return. A 24-year-old equities trader helped at least a dozen people get out, and then he went back in with firefighters to save more. A group of strangers teamed up to take back United Flight 93, preventing the plane from killing untold numbers of people in the US Capitol. 2 former US Marines put their uniforms back on and searched through the rubble that could have collapsed at any moment. And they found 2 survivors. 2 flight attendants on American Airlines Flight 11 calmly relayed information on the hijackers that would help the FBI determine the perpetrators were Al-Qaeda. A tour guide at the Pentagon gave medical aid to the injured outside, then went back into the building while it was still on flames. Finally, 2 unarmed F-16s scrambled to stop any other hijacked airliners, and the pilots were prepared to give their lives to stop them. You know, Jon Stewart, the comedian, he continues fighting for the responders of 9/11. They were denied medical benefits, and he has fought continuously, going to Congress several times to get medical benefits for them. And last year, it finally became a reality. Everyone has a 9/11 story. Emotional experiences leave their imprint deeply on our minds. How many of you remember where you were when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, even though it happened just about 60 years ago? That's just about everybody. Well, 9/11 is this generation's Kennedy assassination. 9/11/2001 was the beginning of a new semester. I was excited because I was teaching a new book in my 8 o'clock reading class that morning. We were reading a book about the Underground Railroad. Now I taught foreign students, and they don't know anything about American history. So you really have to do a lot of preparation before they start reading for them to get the framework of what happened. So I had brought in a segment of a documentary. Then we read a magazine article. And then I brought in the song, Follow the Drinking Gourd, which is about the Underground Railroad. I brought in the lyrics and we sang the song. By the end of the lesson, the students had a pretty good background before they started reading the novel. I was really happy. The students were engaged and eager to start reading. On my way back to the office around 10:30, I passed my colleague's office. She was sitting at her desk, head in her hands, crying. I stepped inside. Marina, what happened? They're gone. Who? I thought someone we knew had died. My heart started beating really fast. The World Trade Center. What? What are you talking about? What do you mean? And then she told me, I know Marina from NYU. And the World Trade Center was very close to us. World Trade Center, iconic symbol of American power and of New York City. You know, anytime a movie took place in New York, they always panned the World Trade Center, so everybody in the world knew where they were. The buildings were personal to me. They had been the backdrop of my apartment when I lived on Chambers Street in Manhattan. The World Trade Center was to the south, and we faced the south. Hudson River was to the right. We lived there for 4 years. I had no curtains on my windows, just huge plants. We got this great south exposure. And there were no buildings in front of us. The first buildings we saw were the World Trade Center. So they were really part of my apartment. This was at that time, over 40 years ago. Today, there are lots of buildings between those two, between where the World Trade Center was and my apartment. In the mornings, we would watch the ships come up the Hudson River. And at 5 o'clock, this warm, shiny, pink peach reflection of the sun would be in all the windows of the World Trade Center. And I'd sit on my couch, drinking my tea, and just watching this. And it was a meditation. And then at night, we'd watch the World Trade Center, click off the lights one floor at a time, and you'd watch them zip off. Every time a relative or friend came from another state or country, the World Trade Center was always our first visit. Now, this was a tremendous loss to me because it was only 6 years after my husband had died. And that apartment symbolized our life together. The World Trade Center was part of that. That was really a finality. Well, I tried to get in touch with my daughters because they were supposed to go to Manhattan that day. And of course, all the phones were down. I tried to get home and I had to take the turnpike from school to my house, but the turnpike was closed down. So I had to go over to the Grand Central, to the Garden State Parkway. And it was bumper to bumper. A half-hour ride home took me almost 2.5 hours to get home. And I was really nervous because there was no way for me to get in touch with my daughters. I got home, they hadn't gone in, and they were safe. Of course, there were lots of other stories that I heard. Just very quick too. My friend Dave McCaw was saved by a problem with his knee. He had an orthopedic appointment that morning. He was supposed to be working at the World Trade Center that day. He went into his orthopedic appointment, and he still carries around this message on his cell phone that says, "Dave, don't come into work today." And then there was Herb Oida, a member of Central Unitarian Church in Paramus. He worked at one of the offices on the bottom floors, and he had gotten his son he had helped him get a great job at Cantor Fitzgerald, which was on one of the top floors of the World Trade Center. Well, Herb and his son went into the World Trade Center every day, and they went home together. But they went in that morning together. Herb came home, but his son did not. For a time after this tragedy, we saw the country and the world come together. After seeing the worst in humanity, we saw the best. We had the goodwill of the whole world. Even though these buildings were here in New York City, they were American buildings, the world felt that these towers belonged to them too. After all, it was in their name, the World Trade Center. I know several people who were in other countries at the time. Nothing but good wishes from everyone. We thought that maybe this goodwill would last and the country being together would be the start of a new millennium. We only hoped. Arlene? Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Okay, I'm going to start with my memory of 9/11, and then I'm going to move in to my students and their responses and memories of 9/11. And I collected data over 12 years on repeated 9/11s. And I excerpted some of that data for this talk, this sermon. Okay. Like all of us, my memories of 9/11 are seared into my consciousness. On that fateful day, I was getting ready to drive to William Patterson University to teach my Women in Modern Literature course. Donna had the television on, and a bulletin came on showing a plane hitting the World Trade Center. The newscaster hypothesized that there was a radar issue or a malfunction with the plane. I continued to watch the ongoing news when I later saw a second plane heading for the World Trade Center and crashing into the second tower. I was horrified. I exclaimed aloud, "This is no accident." As the news continued, I knew I couldn't go into work. I went outside and didn't understand why people weren't in the street sharing their horror at what just happened. Maybe they didn't know. Maybe they all were at work. I went back to our television and saw the towers crashing down. First one, then the other. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Panic set in. My daughter Leah was in downtown New York City for an appointment with her doctor. I didn't know which train she took to get downtown. I couldn't reach her on a cell phone. All I could do was follow the news broadcast and watch the horrifying scene, people running, smoke, and debris. It was about 11 a.m. when Leah called me. She was safe on the east side of Manhattan. She wasn't clear about the enormity of what had happened. I told her, and she understood that was probably why she had a hard time trying to catch a bus to the George Washington Bridge. She called me again later. She was walking to the bridge, getting on a bus for a short distance when she could, and then walking more. It was 4 p.m. when she reached the bridge and told me that buses were shuttling people across, and she was awaiting her turn. At 6 p.m., she had crossed the bridge and caught a bus to Palisade Avenue and the 9W, where Don and I drove to pick her up with gratitude that she was okay amidst all the tragedy. The next day, I went to my classes, and in every class, I asked my students to write their feelings about what happened. They wrote, shared their writing, and we talked. That's what we needed to do after this enormous tragedy, an attack on our country, a country that we had thought was safe from anything like this. Then every year for 12 years after the attack on the World Trade Center, I asked my students to write their memories of 9/11 on the anniversary of that day, and I collected and saved their responses. Responses were quick writes, since I was interested in their immediate thoughts and feelings, no drafting, no rereading in most cases. I wrote an article for one of my professional publications about student responses to 9/11 and made a colloquium presentation. Several themes emerged from my students' writing. One was shock, fear for the future was another, and the sudden awareness that the US is vulnerable to attacks. They were sad, and yet many commented on the kindnesses they had witnessed after 9/11. Most of my students came from northern New Jersey and lived in towns with views of Manhattan, West New York, Union City, North Bergen, East Rutherford, Carlstadt, and more towns with a view of the Manhattan skyline. What follows is mostly what my students had to say. Juan wrote, "It is difficult for me to write the numbers 9/11, for it feels like a curse." A student in my first year seminar class in 2006 wrote that she lost her aunt in the World Trade Center. Many students wrote about family friends who lost their lives. In 2012, a student in my women's sport and culture class, who is a mother, wrote, "I lost 5 friends that day. They were all in the towers when they collapsed. It has taken me the 10 past years to go anywhere near the site. We went in the spring of this year, and it still brings tears to my eyes. Also, seeing the reflective pools and all 5 of my friends' names made it a reality for me. Not that it wasn't before, but it brought all those emotions up." Students who mentioned the wars that followed 9/11 lamented the country's decision to go to war. And throughout the years that I collected data, students wrote that they hoped the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan would end. Many were horrified that the wars continued to take so many more lives. Of course, we know the war in Afghanistan didn't end until 2021. Atina wrote in 2006, peace doesn't seem to be anyone's objective, at least not for those in power. Students wrote about seeing the towers come down from the classroom windows or smelling and seeing smoke. They shared stories about loved ones lost or friends who lost family members. Students who lived in dormitories called the Towers on the William Patterson campus wrote about seeing the World Trade Center buildings come down from their dorm windows. On 9/11, some students had teachers in schools who closed the blinds so the student couldn't see New York City and the site of the World Trade Center. However, most teachers, even those who were crying, kept the blinds open and put the televisions on. Memories of 9/11 fueled my students' anxieties. One young man in 2005 wrote, for months and months after the attack, I had dreams about planes crashing. Beata, a student in another class, wrote, 9/11 still affects me because I knew that terrorism didn't end on 9/11. Perhaps it was only beginning. I would have nightmares about terrorists attacking and planes crashing everywhere. A young woman in 2007 wrote, it has been 6 years and the thought of that day still makes my heart stop and brings tears to my eyes. My father is a firefighter in New York City and was missing at Ground Zero for 10 hours that day. He made it out alive, but some of his friends weren't so lucky. Another student whose father worked for the Port of Authority Fire Department wrote that her family was terrified because they didn't hear from him for 2.5 days. In 2008, Daniel, who was 13 at the time of the tragedy, wrote, from my middle school, we had a perfect view of the New York City skyline. Around 9 a.m., the teachers were instructed to shut the blinds, turn the TV off, and to continue instructing. Once we got home, I looked from my bedroom window and just saw smoke in the sky. Everything changed that day, and nothing will ever be the same. Elena was an 8th grader at the time and wrote, my friends were twins and they lost their dad. It was a horrible memory. I wish I could get rid of it. Monica, a student in my racism and sexism class in 2004, wrote about her grandmother who was late for work and was outside the World Trade Center buying tea from a vendor when the attack took place. Monica wrote, she was extremely traumatized by 9/11. She had seen people jumping out of windows and falling to their deaths. As she ran for safety, she was trampled by many people and injured her hip. Monica added, to this day, I feel lucky, so blessed that my grandmother, who was late to work that day, I'd rather have her alive and emotionally wounded than dead. Sarah, who was a high school student in 2008, wrote, 18 students in my town of Glen Rock had lost loved ones. My cousin and her daughter were in the World Trade Center lobby when the plane hit and escaped injury-free. Stephanie, a women's studies student also from Glen Rock, wrote that 4 parents of students in her school died that day. In 2011, Mary Ellen wrote, I was in 6th grade English class. I went to a private Catholic school. Slowly, children who had family at the towers were being pulled out of class. We were told to start writing our emotions, thoughts, and prayers. She continued, my boyfriend is in the US Navy. On his last deployment, he was aboard the Carl Vinson carrier, and they received and buried Osama bin Laden's body at sea. It was a moment of victory and righteousness. Scapegoating was an issue addressed by Catherine, a women's studies student in 2005. She wrote, I remembered being outraged, particularly by conservative extremists who blamed the tragedy on gays and anyone non-Christian. Marie, a Syrian student, was in Clifton High School on 9/11, and she heard a fellow student say, I bet it was those damn Arabs. She wrote, I was offended and scared. I worry that I will be discriminated against because I am a female and I'm Middle Eastern, and the stereotype offends me more than anything. People think that all Arabs are Muslim. I'm Arab and Catholic. The media has made everyone believe all Arabs are Muslim, yet in fact, an Arab can be any religion. Courtney wrote in 2006 The racism against Arabs has grown rapidly, and it is not fair. In 2012, Vincent wrote, patriotism has turned to stereotyping and hatred for Muslims. I was surprised when reviewing my data to see that several students saw 9/11 leading to the end of democracy. Stephanie, who said that the Bush administration's war with Iraq was about gaining oil, wrote in 2005, in my eyes, 9/11 was the opposite of democracy, which led to the emergence of a political party that resembles a dictatorship. And I feel the American people are paying for it with their lives. It was a way to legitimize institutional racism and a greater degree of social control. Students also shared some positive thoughts. The theme of families, Americans, and people around the world coming together was repeated again and again. A 2005 first-year student wrote, I can remember a sense of unity that I felt wherever I went. Jerry, another student in the same class, wrote, on a positive note, everyone banded together, and this made me feel proud and at peace in some ways to know that in a time of need, people are there for you. Another student wrote, our country is one, and we are united as one. In 2007, a student wrote, everywhere I went after 9/11, I would see flags all over. My cousin and I would salute the flag every time we saw one, and there were so many. Many families began coming together, and more people began going to church. And another wrote, the way that the world came together emotionally and physically for one another was extraordinary. The theme of unity was repeated and repeated. Another student said, one thing I enjoyed seeing was how everyone came together to bring back peace and order. I wish that everyone would remain in that humbleness and togetherness. Respect for heroes and sheroes who risked or gave up their lives to help others moved many students. A student whose aunt worked near the World Trade Center saw millions of pieces of paper just flying around with debris and smoke and added, I have so much respect for the New York Police Department and the New York Fire Department and those who lost their lives to help others. I experienced kindness when I visited Ground Zero about 6 weeks after 9/11. As I walked along the streets of Lower Manhattan, I was deeply saddened by all of the flyers on poles and fences, depicting the names and photos of missing people with pleas for information about them. I proceeded to walk to Trinity Church near the entrance of the Ground Zero site, and I was greeted at the church by a Marine who hugged me and told me he was sorry about my loss. I didn't have a personal loss, but I knew he was referring to our collective loss on 9/11. I was deeply moved by this man and will never forget him. Some students called for activism. Stacy was critical of US consumerism and wrote, I just can't help but think, what if the people who were spending hundreds and thousands of dollars had donated to others who needed help after this tragedy? I don't have a lot of money, but I make sure I help in some way. Judy, a returning adult student, wrote eloquently about her call to channel her activism into preaching acceptance of others, and connected her commitment to social justice with the lessons she learned from 9/11. Serendipitously, yesterday, I met the co-author of the recently published book, United States of Friendship, Pen Pals of 9/11, a story of 2 third-grade classes by Julie O'Connor and Elaine Mazaka. The book tells the story in Elaine's 3rd-grade class in rural Yorkville, Illinois, who wanted to do something for 3rd graders in New York City. So they wrote letters to children in New York City. They were delivered in a packet to, and this was the address, any 3rd-grade class, any elementary school, New York City, New York. The person who wound up receiving this parcel was Julie O'Connor, a 3rd-grade teacher in PS 48 in New York City. She was amazed at the kindness and compassion expressed by children halfway across the country, and decided to have her 3rd-grade class send letters to the 3rd graders in Illinois. This continued throughout the year, with students reaching out and forming pen pal friendships. At the same event where I met Julie, I also met Ernest, a man who was at the World Trade Center when the planes hit, and who was among those who worked for weeks excavating for bodies. Ernest amazed me with his selflessness. In 2016, he developed cancer from his work, but he harbors no anger or regrets. He told me that he just did what he had to do after the tragic attack. I feel that Julie and Ernest were put in my path the day before I was to share this service with Debbie. I want to conclude with the story told by one of my women's studies students. In 2004, she had a profound response to 9/11. She wrote, "Shortly after the attack in my old high school, we began to have discussions on what happened. Most of the class, as you can imagine, was pretty perturbed at the terrorists. But for some reason, I found myself on the opposite side of that discussion. Although I was very upset and sad, to put it mildly, at the terrorists, I just couldn't believe that those attacks were done just out of cruelness. I felt so strongly that it was a retaliation of some sort. Later on in the years, all the underhanded business that Bush Sr. and his son had done was revealed, and I turned out to be right. Also, the Muslim faith became a focal point to me. During this time, I was not a Muslim. It bothered me that I kept saying these people ridiculed on television and around the streets about their religion. So instead of believing what I was hearing, that Islam promotes terrorism, I found it was the exact opposite. And I later myself became a Muslim." Thank you. Okay, at this time, we invite you to unmute